Hello, and welcome to the second part of the 4 sessions we have online for this study unit in Advanced Intelligent Interfaces, ICS 5112. During the last session, I went into some detail about the game design framework that we shall be considering for our series game, and that is your project, Wimbicity. The framework emerges from Caspar Hartveld's triadic game design that attempts to achieve the balance between the three worlds of reality, meaning, and play. Today we shall be exploring together the world of reality. When we talk about game design and authorship, we know that these happen at many levels, and the fields of game research and development involve people from diverse creative and scholarly backgrounds. While it is often necessary to focus on one area, everybody, regardless of the discipline, will at some point need to consider issues outside that area. For example, base mechanisms of game systems, the overarching design goals, or the desired experiential results of gameplay. AI coders and researchers are no exception, and this refers to you. Seemingly inconsequential decisions about data and representation and algorithms, tools, vocabulary, methodology, they will trickle upward, shaping the final gameplay and as well as the desired user experiences. So somewhere these experiences must bottom out, somewhere in the code. As games continue to generate increasingly complex agent, object, and system behavior, AI and game design will merge. And this is where everything comes together in the study unit. Systematic coherence comes when conflicting constraints are satisfied and each of the game parts can relate to each other as a whole. Decomposing, understanding, and creating this coherence requires travel between all levels of abstraction and fluent motion from systems to code to content and play experience and back. Which brings us back to the world of reality and why we're discussing this world. Most games are in some way connected to the physical world. They involve many fantasy elements such as no gravity or not being able to die or having 3 lives, 4 lives, 5 lives, so many lives. But nevertheless, there are always these things that are recognizable and to which we can relate in reality. By associating also the way we behave in real life to how our characters behave in the game life. So if not a game, if these are not present, the game would not be meaningful to us and we would be unable to play it. For example, I do not know any particular games in which players have to avoid an enemy by jumping underneath it, not above it. Let's take the example of Super Mario. Okay, even children from a young age intuitively, okay, they will jump over the enemy. They will press the up arrow to jump over the enemy so as not to get killed. And this is how things work out in reality. You never jump underneath someone, you jump over someone. Of course, players cannot jump that high in reality, so what games do is that they will augment, increase that reality, multiply that reality. And it is also very highly unlikely that they will ever encounter the types of enemies that they encounter in games in reality. So the point is that despite all the fiction elements that a game may contain and that you may design in your games, there are always these connections to reality that will make the experience intuitive and understandable. So this connection between a game and reality suggests that games contain an underlying model of reality. It is, in fact, the representation of reality. When a game is developed, designers, whether consciously or unconsciously, consider aspects of the real world, like people, like the organization, like objects, like any variables and any relationships. And basically they put all these elements together into a model. For example, this can be as simple as representation of familiar objects like a car, okay, together with other example of Newtonian physics, such as how the objects move. So from the car, we can from something which is simple, and we can associate to, so a game that has this, this car moving along, okay, to more complex representations, such as, for example, a complex representation of a political system with political parties, with issues, with secret agendas, which, by the way, this is not something new. These types of games started emerging, discussing politics and policies. They started emerging way back in the 1950s and 60s, where people used the television as a medium to be for people to be able to play these games, putting themselves into roles that expanded and augmented real historical events in the US. So here we've got something from simple moving towards more elaborate, but every time keeping this real connection. It depends very much on the type of game and its purpose, how elaborate and how realistic and how valid this model needs to be. If you take into account your game with the city, well, it does need to be realistic, because it will happen inside, in a real world context of the city. However, there is no particular limit on how many fantasy elements you decide to inject in your game to make the game more fun for the player, for the gamer. So to illustrate another point, a game to promote fitness may be satisfied with simple statistics that indicate how many calories people burn per type of activity, while a game about educating medical students about human body needs to contain every detail about the human body. There was another game developed by students as a prototype, and it was a game about raising awareness about our eating habits and the food that we take in every day or every moment of the day, and how this affects our body. In this case, the gameplay itself, the mechanics of the gameplay, indicated that there didn't necessarily need to be that much detail into the human body, or that much detail into the actual food consumed. But there was just the element of reality to associate the particular food that was represented to the food that we ingest during the day, with real representation of when we tend to ingest the food, so breakfast, lunchtime, and dinner. So in this type of game, there was this fictitious character catching food, okay, dropping by, but when there was the element, when there was the time that was written that was breakfast time, there was a tendency for the player to catch food related to breakfast, more related to what we ingest during breakfast time. And when it was lunchtime, the food varied, and so at dinner time. So you could see that even though the game was very simple, basically, it was a bit like Space Invaders, but in terms of food. So you get food, and you've got to catch the right food as it drops by, and people had to ingest the right food to take the right amount of calories. So again, the element of reality is there, but of course it was purely fictitious, even the character was. So developing this model of reality requires domain-specific knowledge. So if the game is, for example, about the city, as your game is, Win the City, you will need an expert about the buildings that you're going to design your game around, or about the history of Valletta, or that particular neighborhood or location where you are going to set the context of your game. So to retrieve this domain-specific knowledge, subject matter experts are indispensable during the development of a game. So you need to go and ask people, maybe people who live around the area, or people who are historians, or people who have sufficient knowledge about that which you are going to design. So, and these are needed to determine these crucial aspects of reality which you will need to inject into your game. The model of reality is not the game itself. Okay, the model of reality is a conceptual model on which the game is based, partly based. The model will co-evolve during the development. When certain changes are made, they may very likely affect the underlying model of reality. And again, very much like history, any model of reality is quite subjective. It is a subjective depiction of reality as you or your experts see it. So it might not always be, the real truth, whatever that means. Reality most often is interpreted. It is constructed through the people that recount such reality. So what we're having is a reality that is being translated by a group of designers in collaboration with others. So it may happen that there will be contrasting theories on the topic. There might be different information sources. There might be different design choices. There might be ambiguous information. There might be knowledge gaps, differences in scope, well, differences in budget and purpose. It's quite unlikely that two teams, working on the same reality will come up with the same model of reality. So let's take some few examples now to illustrate what we want to say about this by taking into consideration domains that are more central to your area, to your game as well, to Win the City. So first of all, I'd like to take into consideration politics and society, because you might get some ideas from that. And secondly, maybe public policy, because when we're talking about games that involve cities, urban planning, okay, we find a lot of examples. In fact, I do give more examples, videos and references in the Moodle VLE area, with some reference even to literature on the subject of play the cities, or using games to help even urban planning and urban regeneration. So there are different forms of gameplay for different instances. But let's go back to what we have to say about politics and society. Let's take the example, for example, way back in 2008, there was the presidency race for Barack Obama, and John McCain, in one of his speeches, one of the debates between him and Barack Obama, was always mentioning this Joe the plumber, okay, as a person, as a representative of the working class. So very quickly, a game appeared on the internet, and it was titled Joe the Plumber Game. It was basically just a political framing of an existing game format by connecting pipes from one end to another. So this was, again, a game that was already there, but they just reframed it as Joe the Plumber to give it a connection to the real context that was being discussed there and then, and people were playing it. There are other instances about games that have also been connected to events that happened in society. For example, controversially, when there was the Columbine massacre in 1999, there were school shootings, and immediately following that, an RPG game emerged, a role-playing game emerged. It was very controversial because people were playing what happened during the actual disaster, and of course it was a very violent depiction of what happened in reality. But yes, it emerged as a game. We've seen games like, for example, there is a game that has been developed to show the Iranian Revolution in the late 1960s. And again, there was this idea of merging the real happenings, the real historical happenings, with the gameplay, so that players' decisions, whilst not directly affecting what happened in history, could actually help him or her associate to what was happening during that particular time. So that's another game example. For example, there was another game called the redistricting game that can be seen as a critique to on the American political system, where state legislators are able to draw the lines of voting districts, and this makes it open to various degrees of abuses and manipulations. And the game itself would offer 5 missions, each with a different objective. Yet, basically, the game mechanics would boil down to drawing and redrawing districts. By exploring how the system works, the game allows the players to see how one of the most important aspects of the American political system is actually open to abuse, and how this can be improved. This game, aside from raising awareness and helping people criticize the political system, it's also educational in the sense that people start understanding what it means, what it means like to take certain decisions when assuming certain roles. One of the issues when it comes to the context of reality is that of targeting aspects of emotional intelligence, like empathy. When people start associating their gameplay to the real world context, to the real world dilemma, or maybe to the real world situation, then people start walking into others' shoes. And in many games that take into account, for example, urban planning, urban regeneration, how to improve neighborhoods, for example, will help people start empathizing, understanding more about how certain decision makers and key stakeholders affect the rest of the neighborhood, affect the people, affect through the decisions that they are taking. And by understanding these, then they also start changing the real world behavior towards the situations, towards the stakeholders, towards the people. For example, in one particular game, which was called Evoke, it was a serious game that was funded by the World Bank. It was funded for about $500,000, but the target was to engage people on missions to try and solve real-world problems. Of course, real-world problems can't be solved directly by playing a game, but the scope of the game was that of actually encouraging people to go out in the real world, identify something, a small thing which they could themselves do, and then use it to describe the game. One particular case in this was the case of a person who lived in San Francisco, and as part of the game, he actually planted this very nice small patch of garden for the neighborhood. So he created this garden, a small garden for the neighborhood, where people could actually go in, plant some shrubs, take care of them. It was a kind of a community project, and it emerged as a result of the game, and as a result of trying to understand these real world issues through the gameplay. So yeah, when we talk about public policy, for example, we've seen lots of games that are policy-oriented, games traditionally like SimCity, for example. They put players in a position where their actions not only influence the gameplay, but they also influence how they perceive the reality. Remember what we said, that reality is most often subjective. Sometimes we see it from the way we stand, from where we stand. In this case, the game is shifting your position, and you start seeing reality from a different perspective. And that in itself starts changing not just perceptions, but also behaviors and attitudes. So we see these games emerging that help people just move a little bit and start seeing reality from a different perspective. And this also leads to the education of the public about maybe difficult dilemmas that governments would be struggling with, to engage the public with debate, and to raise more awareness, creating what we describe as a participatory model for engaging citizens. We see this kind of emergence as a kind of addition to democracy, giving a voice to the people through the games they play. So how do the dynamics of gameplay affect the real world representation in the games we play? I already mentioned that sometimes games shift our position by assigning to us a different role from that which we currently hold in the real life. But let's, for example, take into consideration a game of Monopoly. In Monopoly, we can, for example, identify feedback systems within the gameplay to determine how particular states or changes affect the overall state of gameplay. So in Monopoly, as the leader or leaders become increasingly wealthy, they can penalize players with increasing effectiveness. Poorer players become increasingly poor, and as the gap widens, only a few of the players would become really invested. So again, there raises the dilemmas of how to engage players, but then again, you might lose dramatic tension and you might lose agency. We can try to fix games, we can try to fix these problems in games, but then again, do we really want to? One question which I would like to end this with is, do we really need to change the reality to make the gameplay extended? And do we really want to mirror and reflect reality? Do we want to augment reality? Or do we want to take people away from reality and place them in a completely new world where everything is possible, where everything is reachable, and where everything is fun? Yeah, I think there's no easy answer for that, and I think that it really depends on the context which you want to bring forward. That is all for today. I do encourage you to take a look at the readings. I do encourage you to start thinking about how to answer your questions when it comes to Windy City and the world of reality. How are you going to merge this reality into the game that you are designing?